So Rishi Sunak's had his first 10 days in office as Prime Minister. I want to ask you, each of you, how you think he's doing so far. Andrew first.
Quite well. I mean, I think when it comes to the performances in Prime Minister's questions, he can do the job. He can get the Tory benches roaring. He can deal with some very, very carefully crafted, tough and sharp questions from Keir Starmer, and he kind of looks and sounds the part. Second, he's got the markets quietened and quelled and relatively reassured for the time being. He's put off those big financial decisions. Third, by and large, the Tory party in Parliament is relatively quiet and quiescent. There aren't big rivalrous groups going for him. But he has made some really big mistakes, and he has got some big trouble ahead.
Great. Okay, thanks. And Rachel?
I would broadly agree with most of what Andrew said there. I think one of the problems that he's had is when he came in, his big selling point was, I'll bring integrity and accountability and honesty at every level. And then one of his first decisions was to reappoint Suella Braverman, Home Secretary. And she obviously had been sort of forced out of her position a week earlier for breaches of the ministerial code. That kind of felt very Boris Johnson and not the new Rishi Sunak, which he'd put himself forward as. So he's a bit of a shaky start, I would kind of say.
I have to say, a lot of the people I know who aren't involved in politics, who are sort of semi-interested in all of this, said to me, kind of along the lines of, I thought Rishi Sunak was a decent sort. I don't understand why he's made that appointment. So I do think that kind of sullied that reputation of him being a sort of, a politician of integrity, as he sold himself as.
I do understand why he made that appointment, because his campaign to become Prime Minister, the internal campaign we barely saw from the outside, depended at a crucial moment on persuading Boris Johnson that although he had just over the required 100 votes to go to the party membership, actually there was so much momentum, so much wind behind Rishi Sunak that it was pointless. And the moment that that appeared to be apparent was when Suella Braverman came out to support him. And it looked, well, if Rishi Sunak has also got that part of the right of the party, it's effectively all over. And Boris Johnson looked at that and thought, OK, I give in. And so you could argue that Suella Braverman was why Rishi Sunak is now Prime Minister. I mean, that's overdoing it a bit, but you could argue that. So he owed her big. I don't think it was a sort of grubby deal in the way that Labour points out like that. I don't believe they had that conversation. But I do think he then thought, I've got some really hard decisions to get through the House of Commons, particularly on tax rises. And it's going to be much harder for the right, as it were, the exiled right, to come after me if I've got Suella Braverman at my elbow. And so I think that's why he did it. But I completely agree with Rachel. I think it's been a really bad decision for him. We're talking about his first 10 days, his first attempt to present himself to the country as a fresh face, a new start. Here we go all over again, and we're straight back into this.
Yes, and actually it is a continuing headache for him because of the scrutiny she's under in terms of the treatment of asylum seekers at the Manston processing facility, which, is just a story that goes on. And what it does is it's highlighting a policy failure for the Conservatives. They haven't managed to stop those channel crossings as they've said they are aiming to do. The Rwanda deal hasn't worked. And so all they're doing really is shining a light on something that they haven't managed to fix.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. If you break down what's gone wrong, I think there are two obvious elements to it. One is relations with other countries. There has been no real attempt to engage the Albanian government and look at why that trafficking thing starts in Albania and what can be done to stop it. There's been no real engagement with the French. In fact, famously Liz Truss kind of more or less insulted Macron, and they're still very, very worried about the Irish border issue. If they had engaged really well with Paris, then perhaps this could have been solved in a different way. But they haven't done those things. So that's a failure. And the second failure is simply a bureaucratic failure. I was talking to somebody who has seen the way the Home Office deals with individual migrant cases. They're still using ancient, outdated, very complex Excel spreadsheets with hundreds of columns to try to deal with this, which is why they're processing things so slowly. So it's an old-fashioned, straightforward management failure.
One of the reasons I think Rishi Sunak put Suella Braverman in there is because he kind of assumed the party had enough credit in the bank to still play culture wars on the issue.
Right.
And because of their fall in the polls, because of the mini budget, because it's at a low in terms of popularity, I think they just don't have the space to do that anymore. So when they try and take risks with the kind of rhetoric that Braverman used in the Commons, this whole, invasion of our southern coast, I just don't think they can get away with that anymore as they could when Boris Johnson was kind of still riding high after the the Brexit vote and after the 2019 election. You know, they're under a new level of scrutiny now.
Yeah, that was a bit of a Boris Johnson trick, wasn't it? Because actually immigration levels are higher than they were before the EU referendum, and actually they've liberalised the immigration system. So in order to make that more palatable, or perhaps to distract from their more right-wing voters, they use that kind of rhetoric, or they introduce the Rwanda deal as Boris Johnson did, and that's the calculation. I don't think that's working anymore.
I think Rachel makes a very, very good point about that. You know, one part of political credit affects the next bit and so on. I thought what was really striking is, you know, you would never in the old days hear the Labour Party going on about immigration. It just didn't happen. And Keir Starmer didn't just use one question in Prime Minister's questions on immigration, have a go at the Suella Braverman sore point. He used every single one of his 6 questions on the sheer allegation of utter incompetence. And I was watching the Tory benches, and yes, they cheered when Rishi Sunak did the predictable business about Brexit, and you once supported Jeremy Corbyn and stuff. But by and large, they knew that Keir Starmer had a good point and was cutting through. And I think Keir Starmer's team thought that was one of his strongest performances at PMQs. And that again goes back to the migration problem.
And can Suella Braverman survive, do you think? I mean, you wrote in your piece for the New Statesman this week that you thought that Rishi Sunak doesn't agree with the rhetoric that she's using for a second, I think you said.
I can't believe that he would approve that word invasion. If he did, he's a much more cynical politician than we have seen so far. I don't believe he did. I think that she can't survive. I don't know when she'll go. I mean, it might be months, it might be weeks, it might be days, but it seems to me that she has made so many errors so quickly that we're waiting for the next one, and that almost certainly there will be a next one. And although she is, as it were, the chosen Boudica of the Tory right at the moment, even that won't save her. You can see there are big parts of the ERG, for instance, who looked at her leaking of sensitive government documents. And the fact that, you know, you talk around Whitehall, lots of people will say, well, she'll just open her mouth and tell you all sorts of extraordinary stuff that she really shouldn't. And, you know, she is Home Secretary. I just don't think this is sustainable in the long term.
Right, okay, so we'll see how that pans out then, because that's a tricky decision for Sunak. But the next challenge for him really, and Andrew, you mentioned this at the top, is the economy. And we're recording just before the Bank of England is expected to put interest rates up again, which could cost the average mortgage holder £1,000 more a year. You know, people are really worried out there. And then you, of course, have the looming autumn statement coming in November. It's been deferred, and, you know, we're being told eye-watering decisions will be made in that statement. So what kind of things are they planning, and what are the toughest decisions?
Well, we keep hearing that tax rises are sort of more likely than the spending cuts at the moment, you know, or they're likely to make up as big a proportion as any spending cuts, because we've got the budget coming on November the 17th.
So that's a tricky sell for some Tory backbenchers.
Absolutely, yeah. I think some of the tax rises that might be more troublesome to Sunak than the spending cuts, I would have thought. But just what proportion they're going to make it up on, we're not entirely sure yet.
No, I completely agree with it. I think the real test for Jeremy Hunt is he needs to be able to say to Tory backbenchers worried about the tax rises, look at having to do on the spending side. Do you really want me to go further on that? Do you really want me to have further cuts on English schools or local authorities or the defence budget? Is that what you want? The price for not doing those things are these tax rises. And I think, I mean, they've been making so much noise about tax rises. There's a lot of softening up going on. They won't be quite as dramatic, perhaps, as we've been hearing. But I think he'll do quite a lot on thresholds, freezing thresholds. Again, gets him about another £5 billion. The Financial Times did a very good breakdown of where the money could come from, I should say. And I think certainly windfall taxes seem to be back on the agenda. It's another Labour idea that's been taken by the Conservatives, or another Labour fox that's being shot, depending on your choice of imagery. But I think we'll see those kind of things. I should also say I think they're going to definitely uprate benefits. I think the triple lock is safe. There's a lot of, is the triple lock safe? A lot of the Conservative press go on and on and on about it, knowing their readers. Their pensioner readers worried about it, but because it was in the manifesto so clearly, we'll come on to the manifesto later, and because Conservative voters are so concerned about it, I think the triple lock is probably safe, and I think uprating of benefits is likely. We will see. Maybe they won't, but it's very hard to understand Rishi Sunak's relentless rhetoric about being compassionate if that's not what it means. I think the tougher stuff will be the departmental spending cuts, which are going to be really, really painful, really bloody, and we'll be talking about Tory austerity 2.0 by then.
Yeah, and remember, we're already in it really because of inflation. That's eating into those departmental budgets already. What about national insurance? Because this was such a big thing when he put it up as Chancellor. It's been reversed. Will he reverse the reversal? And could that spark a row in the party all over again on this issue?
Potentially, yeah. And I think that would also be difficult for Labour because they've voted to get rid of the national insurance, right?
They have to keep switching.
But on the other hand, you've seen that the NHS is saying that it needs another 7 billion amid all of the COVID backlogs and because of the state of the NHS at the moment. So just how are they going to pay for those? You know, that money with the NI rise was supposed to pay for it. So, and every report that we read coming out is that health spending is going to be protected. So how it's going to be paid for is the question on everyone's lips, really.
Yeah, and it's one of the things, you know, most visceral to voters, isn't it? Everyone knows someone on the NHS waiting list now, or they're on it themselves. Excess deaths we now know are higher than they were during COVID. So, you know, why is that? Because people are waiting for treatment and they're getting sicker while they wait.
People have thought it probably won't be cancer. I'll leave it for a bit. It's probably all right. I'll leave it for it, and then it's too late.
And the third challenge, I think, which has already been mentioned in our discussion, is some of the flip-flopping that Rishi Sunak has done since coming in. The flip cop, maybe we can call it.
Flip cop, very good.
Very good. So he said he wouldn't be going to COP, he wouldn't have time, you know, he's too busy with domestic issues. Now it looks like the pressure has meant that he's changed his mind and he will be going. What does this tell you about Sunak as a politician and also his government's approach to the environment?
So the first thing it tells us is that, and this is a truism, but really important, is that being Prime Minister is a dead hard job. It's very, very difficult. Everybody thinks at the top level in politics they're ready for it. Nobody really is. And I think in Sunak's case, he is absolutely a numbers guy. He goes through the spreadsheets, he understands statistically what's going on, and that gives him an inner self-certainty that we have underestimated. He's a tougher politician than we thought, and that's partly because of the numbers aspect. But he's not somebody who has thought very much about foreign affairs in the abstract or about the environment in the abstract. He's told me his daughters keep feeding him the importance of the environment. But, you know, he has been a relatively narrow band politician up to now. And now he suddenly has to look in all directions at the same time. I think simply he just thought, oh, COP. Yes, I know about COP. We don't really need to do COP. And didn't properly consider the importance of it. But it has been extremely embarrassing. He will have to go. It's unfortunate. The King wanted to go and is still not allowed to go. That was damaging. It's part of the very, very fast learning process. I mean, 10 days. He's only been Prime Minister 10 days. He's never been Prime Minister before. He's watched Boris Johnson doing the job very, very differently, and he's got to learn incredibly hard. Incredibly fast.
I was actually in Esher, which is a Tory Lib Dem marginal in the sort of commuter belt of Surrey, on the night of that fracking vote that eventually led to the fall of Liz Truss's government. And, you know, there, even though the main topic was cost of living, even among these affluent voters, the main thing that they'd spotted was King Charles not going to COP. And I realised, you know, when Rishi Sunak made the decision that he wasn't going to go, that was going to be a big issue for him in the so-called blue wall, because these are the voters, presumably, that he is more appealing and reassuring to. So it's very important to sort of that contingent, which is significant for Conservative electoral prospects.
Yeah, and I wonder what Rishi Sunak is going to have to learn, I think, actually, is that you should see problems coming down the track. And I think he should have thought as soon as the issue of COP came up that Boris Johnson was likely to go. And that if he had to get to a position where he looked like he was U-turning after Boris Johnson had confirmed he was going, that would make him look really weak. And that's exactly what happened, and it's exactly what people are saying.
Yeah.
And I just think that's something he should have spotted coming, really, from quite a long way off.
And it does mean that, you know, if you cave to pressure, then there is an incentive for people to apply pressure on other issues.
Yeah, and if you're starting out as a politician, you want to start to look strong in the first instance so that you've got some armour going ahead. And I think if you're doing all these U-turns earlier on, you get a reputation for being a flip-flopper.
Well, yeah, there have been other U-turns, haven't they? We've heard that all those pledges he made over summer in the leadership campaign are now up for review.
So this is, I think, a really, really interesting, almost constitutional issue, because he made lots and lots of pledges, including 10 pledges on sorting the migration problem and many, many other things during that leadership contest. But those were pledges made to this very small Conservative Party membership, not to the country, but to the members, and he lost that election. So what is the status of pledges made in an election if you've lost it? Now, the answer is that's all we really know about Rishi Sunak's wider political philosophy, so they matter. But they're now going through them all in number 10, looking at the cost, the deliverability, the plausibility of each of those pledges for the first time, which means that there is almost an entire blank sheet. He says he wants accountability. How can he be accountable if there's nothing that we can, as it were, pin on him? He goes back to the 2019 Conservative Manifesto, and he goes back to that again and again and again because he's trying to answer the charge that he is not really constitutionally allowed to be Prime Minister. He didn't win that 2019 election. It was Boris Johnson, who, by the way, is rusting around in the undergrowth again very vigorously this week. So his answer is, that wasn't Boris's manifesto, that was the Conservative Party manifesto. That was my manifesto too, and therefore as Prime Minister, that is what I look back to. But it was a very interesting choice of words. When he spoke outside Downing Street, he said that he was going to stand by the promise of that manifesto, not the promises in that manifesto, not what it says on page 4 about education or whatever, but the promise, the general kind of warm glow. Trust me on the warm glow, but not the details. And that really won't wash.
I mean, that's probably why voters are so keen on a general election. On the day that Liz Truss resigned, I was out reporting in Middlesbrough and everyone assumed there would be one. It wasn't even, let's have one. It was, when is it? You know, and I think that's partly why, because people feel a real detachment from what the new agenda is, which will be why he's sort of having to say that he's going back to the 2019 manifesto all the time.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that sort of the questions that might come with the questions that will be answered with the budget rather would be like, what is this government for? What's it all about? I think, like, because when you look at sort of the cabinet, it's like you've got someone like Andrew Mitchell is in international development, and then you have someone like Suella Braverman as Home Secretary, and it just it's a bit of a weird mishmash.
There isn't a story, is there, Rachel?
There's not a thread that seems to run through it that says this is who Rishi Sunak is and where he's going to take the country. And I wonder if, because we'll get to see what compromises he's going to make in the budget, that we'll learn a bit more about what his priorities are. But it's a bit of a puzzle at the moment.
Yeah, and a puzzle that Labour has to figure out. This is my last question to you before the second section, but how do you think Keir Starmer has been doing in response to a Rishi Sunak premiership, and what are the challenges for Labour that it presents?
Well, first of all, can I just say, it's really, really good to see some relatively grown-up, proper exchanges across the chamber of the House of Commons. Starmer, I think, has been doing extremely well. I think he's been much more focused. He's sounded almost as if he meant it more than before. A little bit angry, there's been more of a cutting edge, which we've needed to see.
There was a line, start governing for once and get a grip. Yeah. I thought that was quite good.
His questions are shorter, his sentences are shorter, he sounds more pumped up, he sounds more like the leader a lot of Labour Party MPs always hoped that he was going to be. So he's been doing well, but I have to say that Sunak has been doing much better in response than you might have expected. It's completely different from the Truss performances, and in a good way, different from the Boris Johnson performances. There is less bluster. He still avoids questions, but there's less just general kind of noise and vocabulary. Johnson was the great adverbs and adjectives Prime Minister. Sunak is the numbers Prime Minister. But I think those have been more serious exchanges. Where Keir Starmer is absolutely right, he's telling his shadow cabinet again and again, just don't believe these opinion polls. That this is a blip, they're not real. You know, you're going to have to fight for every single vote. There's a long, hard slog election coming up. In a way, we're all in the early stages of that election campaign. We just don't know whether it's going to take for 4 weeks or 2.5 years.
And Rishi Sunak seems to be pulling ahead on economic competence, which is an important measure in elections. Is that something that they're talking about in Labour circles?
I think that's something that still worries them. They know that that's their weak spot, is always going to be on the economy, and it seems there's quite a lot of polls that put Rishi Sunak as an individual leader ahead of Keir Starmer as well, which kind of worries them, which I think that's why probably seeing a step up in tone from the Labour leader. Starmer doesn't seem to want to allow them any optimism. He wants them to kind of bed down, saying, you know, we need to behave like we're behind in the polls and that the election's 2 years away. Yeah, it's like a long slog. But I think Sunak really needs to get like some new lines.
Sounded a bit tired, I thought.
Like, you know, and he did it his first week and his second week, just doing this whole, oh, well, you campaigned to put Jeremy Corbyn in number 10, and but you campaigned against Brexit. You know, it's kind of like we've heard all of those ones before, and I think Starmer's been leader for 2 years now. I think the public's quite used to him, and they know that he's not Jeremy Corbyn. They know that Jeremy Corbyn's been kind of booted out and he's had the Labour whip removed. So I think, like, you know, Labour seems to have responded and to the challenges as they are now when it comes to that sort of duel at the dispatch box. But I don't know if Sunak's quite there yet. He's going to have to change the record a little, I think.
Yeah, I think one thing that probably is more likely to gain political traction is this, well, what's your plan? You know, that's often what you hear from voters, actually, is, well, I always see Keir Starmer criticising them, but, you know, what's his idea?
Well, the answer on immigration, because I was asking the policing shadow minister about it, I said, well, what is your plan? And she sat down and read out about 5 pages of extremely detailed immigration policy. So a lot of it is there, but it needs to be honed down and turned into not necessarily 5 pledges, but certainly a relatively small number of quite short sentences that people at home start to repeat to each other. That's what needs to be done. It's more of a sharpening and selling job, I think, than the raw policy.
I wouldn't underestimate how big an issue crime is going to be. Crime rates are going up all the time. It's like working class people notice it in their lives and in their communities. Yeah. Antisocial behaviour is a big issue. And Labour's kind of already started to hone this kind of prevent, protect, punish line, and I think that'll become centre stage just as much the economy, but I think potentially over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think one Labour advisor said to me recently, if we can't win on crime, then we don't deserve to win.